Hello and welcome to the second of the three lost lectures here. So this is the recording for the lecture on strategy in the global environment that the audio for some reason was not recorded. So again, the housekeeping issues are less relevant here, but for today's lecture, or for this lecture, we're going to be talking about national competitive advantage. We'll talk about increasing profitability and profit growth through global expansion. We'll talk about cost pressure and pressure for local responsiveness and the tensions between those and different strategies or different global strategies that can be used to navigate the tensions between cost pressures and local responsiveness. Then we'll talk about the choice of entry mode, different ways in which firms can enter new markets, not just in different national markets, but different markets generically. And then we'll end with an idea that wasn't included in the textbook, but something that I find particularly interesting and relevant to my research on rural entrepreneurship, this idea of different kinds of distance. So let's jump right in and talk about globalization and of production and entering different markets. And there's this idea that because of different factors, that there's a reduction in the cost of traveling across space and time. So not only is it cheaper for people to cross space and do so in shorter amounts of time, but also ideas can go across time and space much easier, and products and services can cross space and time more easily. And this is in part due to advances in technology. So goods, knowledge, capital can travel thousands of miles in literally hundredths of a second. There's also been a proliferation of trade agreements and reductions of tariffs. And consumer preferences are becoming more global. So, the appeal of the iPhone is just as strong in Korea as it is in Mexico. And so there's this homogenization of consumer preferences for certain products and services. And the implications of which are quite significant. So home markets have become inundated by foreign competitors. So one of the very interesting things in American history and American economic history is many of the American brands for much of the 20th century had largely a monopoly on the markets that they serve. So U.S. auto manufacturing, U.S. appliance manufacturing grew to be quite large. But as soon as foreign markets started to become available, many of these American companies faced a number of significant challenges and were no longer economically viable. We saw this again happen in the 90s when the North American Free Trade Agreement was signed. Here in North Carolina, NAFTA had some devastating effects. It in large part decimated our textile industry, which was a large industry in the state. It had devastating effects to our furniture making industry, with a lot of those manufacturers choosing to relocate in Mexico because U.S. labor was no longer competitive with Mexican labor. It also does provide some good things in that for businesses. So it's not just that globalization increases the competitiveness, but it also allows access to low-cost input factors. So a lot of those U.S. firms that relocated did so because they were able to get labor at cheaper prices and ultimately capture more value by lowering their production costs. And so this includes labor, also natural resources, and regulation. That regulation can drive up costs, and so locating the countries with lower regulation can reduce costs. The other implication is that new ideas are coming from historically overlooked places. So much of the Sigma 6 and lean manufacturing that we talked about, a lot of those ideas, while originally developed by American business professors, were implemented and proven to be successful in the Japanese auto manufacturing industry. And so the way we do things here in the U.S. and in Western Europe may not always be the best way, and globalization has allowed us to learn and understand from new markets that may have traditionally been overlooked. And globalization also allows for new potential markets, and so mature industries can have a bit of a renaissance by expanding into these new markets. So there are some challenges and benefits that globalization provides, and ultimately I would suggest that globalization brings with it a number of positive features. But these costs and these consequences do have to be considered, and so globalization can be a great thing for businesses as long as it's handled in such a way that ultimately leads to greater value creation rather than focusing exclusively on value capture. And I think a lot of the problems that we've seen with globalization have been largely due to the fact that firms have focused on value capture and have become exploitative in their globalist expansion rather than focusing on value creation. So there is an interesting thing, though, is that while globalization has continued to proliferate, there are some limits, and so there was for a number of years this idea of the death of distance hypothesis, this idea that geographic location should no longer lead to firm competitive advantages because firms are now able to source inputs globally. So this idea that where you locate as a business shouldn't matter. But what we've seen is that really hasn't come true. There are certain industries in some countries that are more competitive than others, and this raises the question as to why this is occurring. And so our friend Michael Porter came up with this idea of national competitive advantage, and what he argued was that difference in home country advantages are going to have different effects on the industries, that location-based value chain advantages are going to differ in different countries, and that differences in government policies, tax rates, and economic conditions are going to affect industries differently, as well as the currency exchange rates and differences in buyer taste and preferences for products and services. And so, the reason why we're kind of interested in these different factors that would make an industry more or less interesting or more or less competitive based on geographic location is that this helps us predict where new foreign entrants are likely to come from and what their strengths are. It also highlights foreign market opportunities and where rivals are weakest. And it also helps identifying the location-based advantages of conducting certain value chain activities of a firm in a particular country. So, we might think that a lot of these questions about why one country is stronger in textiles or in pottery or ceramics than another country, that these are questions that are largely left to public policymakers and folks interested in government and economic development. But these have real business implications, and if you're able to understand these factors and how they affect your industry or industries in which you operate in, that it can give you a potential advantage over your competitors, because it will show you where the greatest threats are going to come from, where the greatest opportunities are. So let's dive into some of these attributes of the national competitive advantage a little bit. So factor endowments. So a nation's endowment in terms of national, human, and other resources. And the general idea is that there are certain countries, certain parts of the world that have different allotments of different sorts of resources and capabilities. Canada is rich in timber. Saudi Arabia is rich in oil. And so there are different parts of the planet, different countries, different regions that have different endowments of these resources. Now, the endowments that are particularly interested are the homegrown resources and capabilities, and that countries actually what's interesting is that countries that are rich in natural resources, raw materials, tend to really struggle to be competitive on a global scale, whereas countries, firms in countries that have endowments of capabilities tend to be quite competitive. And so a very interesting thing to look at is that if you look at the natural and gas businesses, so the companies that are in the are in the gas and natural gas extraction, very few of them are actually Middle Eastern companies. That many of them are Scandinavian countries, English companies, and American companies. And in large part, that has to do with the fact that we have certain capabilities and certain knowledge, endowments in Scandinavia and in the United States that give those firms a competitive advantage over countries that may have a rich endowment of natural resources. Similarly, local demand conditions. These are the specific characteristics of demand in a firm's domestic market. Can also make firms the geographic location of an industry. Typically, what we see is that the high local demands tend to lead to better global competitiveness, and that disconcerting domestic customers drive quality and innovation. So a great example of this is the commercial fishing businesses that because of the Japanese having high quality standards for their fish, what we see is a lot of the international leaders in the fish industry tend to be Japanese. The existence of related and supporting industries, so the presence or absence in the nation of supplier and related industries that are internationally competitive. So leadership in related and supporting industries can also foster world-class competitors in downstream industries. And this is the idea behind industry clusters. As we've seen that in Silicon Valley, that because you had a number of computer manufacturers, that led to a number of software companies also being located in Silicon Valley. So in part because of the existence of these related industries. And the idea behind clusters, one of the interesting things is an idea called knowledge spillover, in that an idea or an innovation that emerges in one business can be quickly adopted and understood by another business. And what's interesting is that these spillover effects seem to have clear geographic limitations. That the closer two businesses are to each other, or a group of businesses are to each other, the more likely the idea is to diffuse. And part of this makes sense if we understand that human beings are largely social creatures, and that we learn a lot better from another person than we do by reading the same information that was transferred from a book or on a website. And so the physical close proximity has particularly interesting effects. And then firm strategy, so the structure and rivalry of firms, the conditions in the nation governing, so how companies are created, organized, and managed. In some countries, it's easier to file for bankruptcy. And so what we see is that we tend to see more risk-taking in countries that, or startups in countries that allow for easier filing of bankruptcy. We also see that highly competitive environments tend to stimulate firms that outperform others. And so in countries where there's a high level of competition, that those competitors that win out in the local markets also tend to win out on international markets. So increasing value creation and capture through global expansion. So how do we make, how is global expansion profitable? Well, one is expanding the market of domestic offerings by selling products in international markets. realizing greater cost economies by serving an expanded global market, realizing location economies by dispersing individual value creation activities to locations around the globe where they can be performed most efficiently and effectively, and leveraging valuable skills developed in foreign operations and transferring them to other entities within the firm's global network or operation. So these are 4 different ways in which expanding globally may lead to greater value creation or greater value capture opportunities. So let's look at these each individually here. So expanding the market, leveraging products. So a company can sell its goods developed at home and sell them internationally, increasing its market. The success of this depends on the type of goods and services and the firm's underlying core competencies. So a key point here is that sometimes what is in demand in foreign markets is in fact the finished product or good, but more often than not, what we see what is in demand in foreign markets is in fact the core competency that developed that product or service. How locally produced products and services are sold in foreign countries may differ, and ultimately what we're doing is expanding product markets or expanding capabilities. The related idea that I've touched on a few times this semester is the bottom of the pyramid strategies, and these are strategies in which you expand a product or service, but that you have to re-envision the way in which that product or service is delivered to customers because of the economic conditions in foreign markets. So what we know is that 90% of the consumers on the planet are in the lowest economic income level, and so something like selling laundry detergent, selling in a box of 50 loads is not going to make sense in a developing country, and so maybe instead of selling 50 loads, selling your laundry in 50 load boxes, you have to sell them in single serving. But the getting back to the this idea of expanding your market globally through your core competencies, a great example of that is McDonald's. So the very interesting thing is that McDonald's exists. There are McDonald's around the world, but the individual products and services or the individual products that you buy at McDonald's is going to differ vastly depending on the country that you're in. But the underlying capability of quick serve, high quality, clean, safe to eat food is the same no matter where you are. And so while you may not be eating a Big Mac in India, you may be eating a veggie burger, the idea of a quick serve restaurant is the same. And so what McDonald's has actually done in their global expansion is not so much sold their products, but sold their knowledge or their ability to transform products, raw materials, into a finished good on an international scale. Now, the other way in which you can benefit through global expansion is through cost economies. So spreading out the fixed costs and setting up production facilities over its global sales volume. So we've talked a lot about the benefits of economies of scale, and so if you're selling on a global market, you're able to spread out those fixed costs over a higher volume, which can be particularly interesting. This is most interesting when the taste and preferences of consumers in different nations are similar, if not identical. So if you have to customize for each market, you're not able to take advantage of those economies of scale as much. And if the costs of manufacturing are significantly lower in some geographic locations than others, so if there is a location in which producing concrete is particularly cheaper in one location than another, then this is attractive. Where there are significant scale economies and where there are significant economies of scale and experience benefits, but it's less interesting when there's highly differentiated customer preferences and when there's high transportation and transaction costs, or when there are diseconomies of scale or few experience benefits. So one of the very interesting things that we see is that home appliances, there tend to be the domestic businesses that dominate the home appliance industry, or at least if it is an international company, that the manufacturing is done largely in the country where the products will ultimately be purchased by the customer. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that it's very expensive to transport home appliances. These are large items that are very expensive to transport. The other interesting thing is that different countries have very different tastes and preferences and needs for home appliances. So in the United States, we tend to have very large refrigerators. We tend to have very large washing machines and dryers. Whereas in the European market, they have much smaller refrigerators and much smaller washing machines. And part of this is that homes are much bigger in the United States than they are in Europe. The kinds of clothes that people wear are different in different countries. So the features on an American washing machine, where we wear a lot of athletic wear and synthetic materials, may be different than Europe, where they tend to dress in a little bit more fancy clothes than we do. So home appliances are one industry in which we don't see these economies of scale operating. Location economies. So these are the economic benefits that arise from performing a value creation activity in an optimal location. And it helps when a company achieve a low-cost position or to differentiate its product offerings, to gain a competitive over rivals who base all their value creation activities in a single location. And the transportation costs and trade barriers complicate this process of realizing location economies. So one of the location economies that a lot of companies have looked at is labor costs. That in certain countries there are much lower labor costs. And we can look at, in 1999, it literally cost 10 times as much for the same quality labor in Germany than it did in Mexico. And then in the United States, it was again, almost twice as expensive for labor costs in the United States compared to Mexico. But an important thing to think about when taking advantage of these particular cost advantages of different countries is that you have to look at the whole cost. And so if we compare labor costs in the U.S. to Mexico, labor costs are much lower in Mexico than in the United States. But once you factor in labor and shipping costs, that in fact it becomes cheaper to produce a product in the United States, produce a car in the United States than it does to produce the car in Mexico, even with the huge difference in labor costs between the two countries. And one of the interesting things is around the late 1990s, early 2000s, there was a huge wave of U.S. low-tech manufacturing that moved, that left the United States for Southeast Asia, again to take advantage of the cheap labor costs in Southeast Asia in comparison to the United States. But what we're seeing now is a reversal of this trend. That even though labor costs in Southeast Asia remain relatively low compared to the United States, because of all the other costs associated with manufacturing in Southeast Asia, that it's actually more cost effective to produce that product here in the U.S. And so we're seeing many companies returning to the U.S. after leaving for 15 or 20 years because of the cost benefits because of the total cost benefits of manufacturing in the U.S. in comparison to Southeast Asia. Now, a related idea is the leveraging of the skills of a global subsidiary. So there are valuable skills that can arise anywhere within a firm's global network. And this can create a global web of activities. And so you have different stages of the value chain that are dispersed to those locations around the globe where perceived value is maximized or the cost of the value chain are minimized. In order to take advantage of this, managers have to establish an incentive system that encourages local employees to acquire new competencies. You also have to have a process for identifying valuable new skills created in a subsidiary and help transfer those skills within the firm. So one of the interesting stories about Sigma 6 and the lean manufacturing is that a lot of when the Japanese auto manufacturers wanted to open up plants in the United States, the idea was that they were going to also implement this lean manufacturing style that they had been able to be so competitive with American auto manufacturers. But what they found was that the American workforce was highly resistant to this new way of manufacturing. And so it was quite difficult for the Chinese auto manufacturers to convince their employees to adopt these new skills and techniques. But we can look at almost any product or service and see that product was made with parts from all around the world. And if we look at a more complex product such as a Boeing 787, we can see that its parts are made literally across the world. And so one of the challenges for Boeing is managing and organizing this huge global network of suppliers that it has. So there are advantages to sourcing these different products in the country in which they have the greatest advantage. But there are significant costs that have to be considered as well, particularly the managing costs of such a vast network. Now, I want to talk a little bit about this idea of the tension between cost pressures and pressures for local responsiveness that we've kind of touched on a little bit here. Now, we understand that standardizing production reduces costs. This economies of scale and experience. That standardized production allows for maximizing value of specialized knowledge and capabilities, and that it also allows for a higher level of control and supervision of quality. And that when there are commodity type products that fill a universal need, there's no having a standard product makes sense. So a need that exists where the tastes and preferences in consumers are exactly the same across different nations and different cultures. However, there's also a need for local responsiveness, that not all consumers have the same tastes and preferences, and that there are differences in traditional practices and infrastructure, and that there are differences in distribution channels. Host governments are going to have different demands on companies. And there's this interesting trend of the rise of regionalism, this kind of buy local movement. It's not something that we just see here in the United States, but it's very much a global movement where more and more consumers are interested in buying products and services that come from their local region, or that there is a particular interest in a region that has a tradition. So France is a very interesting example in that there's very little reason to maybe argue that the French make the best wines, but there is a certain cachet and a certain je ne sais pas quality to French wine. So this idea that certain regions have a cultural or have a subjective appeal is something that is more and more businesses are paying attention to. Now, the tension between the benefits of standardization and the benefits of responding to local demands are going to differ depending on the industry. So there's certain industries, such as funeral services, in which you have to be highly responsive to local demands and be responsive to local tastes. With funeral services, you're going to have different governmental regulations based on how you can perform a funeral service. You have vastly different cultural tastes and preferences. Um, and so, a funeral service is not likely to be an industry in which you're going to be able to have a high level of standardization. By contrast, jet engines are an industry in which, a jet engine is a jet engine. And if you sell that jet engine to go in an American plane, or if you sell it to go in a Egyptian plane, the tastes are going to be very similar across different markets. So there's going to be benefits to global standardization for jet engines. There's going to be benefits to responding to local responsiveness in the funeral service industry. And then there are some industries in which there are very few benefits to being responsive to local industries or to standardization. So with the manufacturing of cement, because the cost of transportation of cement is so high, it's very unlikely that there's going to be much economies of scale benefits that you can take advantage of. Similar with auto repair, in order to repair an auto, the consumer has to bring you their car to fix it, and it's highly unlikely that a consumer is going to bring their car. They're going to travel very far in order to fix your car. So again, the benefits of global integration and the benefits of local responsiveness are going to differ depending on the industry that you're in. And so we can think about these, these two axes and these different clusters, and we can think about different kinds of generic strategies that emerge. So when the pressure for local responsiveness is high, but the pressure for cost reduction is low, you're going to have a localization strategy. And when the pressure for local responsiveness is low, but the pressure for cost reduction is high, you'll have a global standardization strategy. So let's kind of talk through each of these four generic strategies a little bit. Starting with the global standardization strategy. It's when a company market to a standardized product worldwide. So they're focusing on increasing profitability and profit growth through the cost efficiencies that come from economies of scale and the learning effects, and then the location economies. And it's most appropriate when the pressure for cost reductions are strong and the demand for local responsiveness is minimal. Now the localization strategy, these are when you focus on increasing profitability by customizing a company's goods, and you're providing a good match to the tastes and preferences in different markets. And this is most appropriate when consumer tastes and preferences differ across nations, when the cost pressures are not very strong. The benefits are that you produce value in local markets. The product has value in local markets. The limitation is that the cost reduction by mass producing a standardized product is not possible. The transnational strategies, it tries to simultaneously achieve low cost through location economies of scale, and learning effects, and differentiate the product offering across geographic markets to account for local differences. And to foster a multi-directional flow of skills between different subsidiaries. And this makes sense when there are both high cost pressures and high pressures for local responsiveness. But it can be difficult to pursue because it places conflicting demands on a company. So a situation in which do you respond to local demands, or do you maintain standard operating practices across your organization? And what we see is McDonald's is an example of a transnational strategy in which there are standardizations that they've implemented across restaurants in different countries, but they also are sensitive to local demands. And so there is a question about the tension between localized demands and the cost efficiencies. So the size of a hamburger, for example, that McDonald's may be able to if they standardize the size of the hamburger, even if what's in the hamburger is different, then they can produce the same boxes or the same wrappers at a single facility and ship those out internationally. But if you start changing the size of the burgers, then your ability to take advantage of that diminishes. And so there's a tension there between, do you respond to local demands or do you take advantage of cost efficiencies? And finally, there are international strategies, and these occur when companies establish manufacturing and marketing functions in each major country they do business in, and that local customization of product offerings and marketing strategies are limited in scope. So this is most appropriate when products serve universal needs and companies are not confronted with cost pressures. And so this is a strategy that we see in the hotel industry. In which what you'll see is that for different hotel companies, they often have national headquarters for each of their countries, but that the idea of what a hotel does is very similar regardless of the country that you're in. So here's a nice table with different features of the different strategies and how they differ in comparison to each other. Now, an important thing to remember is that there's going to be changes in strategy over time. So as competition increases, international and localization strategies become less viable because of the downward pressure on prices as pseudo-monopolies are lost and other alternatives emerge. And their unique value creation that a firm that's expanding into a new market might present can be copied by and improved upon by local competitors. And so in these situations, to survive, firms may need to shift to a global standardization strategy or a transnational strategy in advance of competitors. So graphically, what we see is that the international strategy and the localization strategy, while those may be successful initially, as competition increases, that they may be forced to pursue a global standardized strategy if the pressures for local responsiveness are low. But if not, they may need to pursue a transnational strategy. Let's think about how firms can enter international markets. And what we can think about is that when you're expanding into new markets, so international markets, but expanding into a new market of any kind, there are two kind of tensions or two factors that you're considering. So the first is the degree of ownership and control, and then the other is the extent of investment and risk. And what we tend to see is that if you want a high level of ownership and control, that increases the amount of investment and risk that you have to also accept. And so we can think about different types of entry based on these. And so let's dive into some of these a little bit more detail. So, starting from those with the least amount of control and the least risk, moving up to those with the highest level of control but the greatest risk. So starting with exporting is the manufacturing of a product in a centralized location, and then exporting it to other national markets. Licensing, is when you sell the right for a foreign manufacturer to produce a company's product line in their country for a negotiated fee. Franchising, when there's which we've talked a little bit about already, in which the franchisor expects the franchisee to abide by the rules governing how it does business. Strategic alliances, when there's cooperative agreements between companies from different countries that are actual or potential competitors. Joint ventures, when there's a 50-50 level of control between a foreign and a local manufacturer. And then wholly owned subsidiaries, when a parent company owns 100% of the subsidiary's stock. Now again, there are advantages and disadvantages to these different forms of entry, and so you can kind of think through, and many of these are quite intuitive. Now the reason why you would choose a different strategy of entry also has to do with the distinctive competencies that your company has. And so if your company's distinctive competency is its technological expertise, licensing and joint ventures should be avoided, and wholly owned subsidiaries should be given preference. And the reason why is because if you are entering into a license or a joint venture with a potential competitor, if it's the knowledge that is of economic value, and once the knowledge is obtained, the product or service can be reproduced, that you risk teaching your competitors, potential competitors, how to beat you. Combination of franchising and subsidiaries for service companies whose distinctive competitive advantages is management proficiency. So, again, let's think about the hospitality industry. Their distinctive competency is not necessarily in the providing the service, but in how you manage and organize the service. And so that's why we see the hospitality industry, pursuing the franchising and subsidiary strategies. So the pressures for cost reduction in entry mode. So companies pursuing global or transnational strategies prefer establishing wholly owned subsidiaries because it gives them tight control over marketing to coordinate a globally dispersed value chain. It gives them tight control over a local operation, and it enables use of profits generated in one market to improve competitive position in another market. So we can think of a clothing manufacturer is likely to pursue a transnational or a global strategy, in part because they want to make sure that quality control is met in international markets, and they also want to make sure that if they're profitable in one segment or in one market, they can use profits in that market to expand and grow in another. Now let's talk a little bit about global strategic alliances. And these are cooperative agreements between potential or actual competitors. And we talked a little bit about in the last lecture about the interesting strategic alliance between Samsung and Sony. That these are competitors that compete with each other head to head, but that they work with each other in order to solve a potential problem. And the interesting thing is that the number of strategic alliances has grown dramatically over the last decade or so. And there are a couple of reasons for this. The first is that it facilitates entry into foreign markets. It allows firms to share the fixed costs and the risks. And it brings together complementary skills and assets that neither partner could easily develop on its own. So one example of potential strategic alliance that may emerge is between a German kitchen knife maker and a Japanese kitchen knife maker. The Japanese knife makers have particular expertise and competencies in forging blades, whereas German manufacturers have particular expertise in balancing knives and making handles. And so you may find a situation in which you have a strategic alliance between firms that typically compete with each other, but work together in order to take advantage of the unique knowledge and expertise of each company. Again, with the Sony and Samsung, that it helps establish technological standards for the industry. But there are some disadvantages. It can give competitors low-cost routes to new technology and markets. And you always run the risk of giving away more in a strategic alliance than you receive. So in order to avoid some of these problems, it's important to make good decisions about your partner selection. So collect as much information about your partner as possible. Is this a company that's likely to screw me over? Is this a company that I can trust? Gathering data from third parties, talking to different people, and getting to know the potential partner well before committing. So making those, having those conversations before the strategic alliance is met. Also, setting up the structure it can be an important way. So to design it to make it difficult to transfer technology that's not meant to be transferred. Setting up contractual safeguards that can be written into an alliance to protect against it. And then also, making sure that it's clear ahead of time, what the agreement is about. What are you going to share with each other? So, so the last thing I want to talk about is this idea that distance still matters. And so, again, my research on rural entrepreneurship, one of the interesting things that I think about is that one of the unique features of running a business in a rural place is that you're very far from other markets. And so when I think about what does it mean to be very far, we can have some interesting conversations. So why distance still matters. So there's this interesting issue that many efforts to expand internationally fail. That there is no Starbucks in Israel, there's no McDonald's in Bolivia, and Walmart has failed to be successful in Germany. So we tend to overestimate the extent of westernization. That I would argue that we tend to think that because a product or service is demand and well liked in the U.S., that product or service is going to be liked by Ethiopian consumers. And while there are a lot of similarities, people are people regardless of where you go. There are unique cultural differences that continue to exist, and so something that an American consumer likes may actually be disliked in a foreign market. And while the technology may be making the world a smaller place, it's not eliminating the cost of distance. And it's important to think about the specific kinds of distance that we're thinking about. And so, there's cultural distances, there's administrative and political distances, there's geographic distance, and there's economic distance. And these are all going to have different effects, on your company, and the distance that you're trying to cover may not always be the same in one of these areas as in the other. And I think actually one of the interesting things to think about are situations in which you may be very close in one kind of distance but very far in another. So if we think about the situation in terms of geographic distance, there is substantial geographic distance between New York City and London. But in terms of economic distance, these locations are quite close to each other. In terms of cultural distance, London and New York are quite close to each other. And so, the geographic distance between London and New York is very far, but you have these other kinds of distance that may be more important in some cases than the other. And this is one of the reasons for why banking, why there's so many U.S. firms that are able to be successful in London, is because geographic distance, because of the high-speed telecommunications that now exist. The geographic distance isn't very important, but the cultural and economic distance and administrative and political distance is quite important. Conversely, we might find ourselves in a situation in which the geographic distance is quite short, but the cultural or the economic distance is significant. And so this is often the case that I find when I'm talking about rural entrepreneurs, in that they may geographically be located relatively close to a large market, but that there are significant cultural differences between a rural entrepreneur and an urban consumer, despite the fact that they are only located 20 miles apart from each other. So we can think of a city like Asheville, North Carolina. So Asheville is an incredibly progressive city. It's if you want to get your your tie-dye T-shirts and your patchouli incense, Asheville is the place to go. But Buncombe County, the county that Asheville is in, is an incredibly conservative, socially conservative county. It's actually where it used to be, where the North Carolina KKK was centered, was in Buncombe County. So you have a situation in which, in downtown Asheville, you're going to have very progressive and ultra progressive consumers. But then you drive outside of city limits, and you're going to find folks that are incredibly conservative. And so you have a situation in which the cultural distance is quite large, but the geographic distance is quite different. So here's a nice table that I found in a different textbook that talks about the different distances and then talks about the ways in which, or the different industries that are affected by those differences. So this is the second of the three lost lectures. So I'm going to try and get to the third lecture here this afternoon, and then hopefully you guys will be able to have all of the lectures up and recorded for your exam.